it does cost more to do case management, to provide safe spaces, to ensure people are being given the tools and supports and services they need. It costs way less than when they're on the street. I think we tend to assume like a $0 figure when somebody's out on the street, but that's not it. Not only for them as people, but for us as a city, not just in like trash pickup and it's emergency department visits, it's calls for service, it's like name it. And then you add on what that individual is now experiencing in terms of cumulative trauma, cumulative issues. I mean, the cost for every day, every minute someone's on the street is not zero. And so I think it's important that we talk about cost and frame, because I do appreciate people's concerns with something like safe camping and parking. I really do. It's not ideal. If it were up to me, we would have had all the housing, not just today, to use T's point, but yesterday. We would have those options. Our shelters and our streets are full of people who have income who are never going to afford a market rate rent. It's just not possible. We could build, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were like, how much market rate housing will we need to build to make sure there's no homelessness? And they were like, that's not possible, right? Like this economist was like, no, I mean, yes, that will lower costs for middle income families and for working families, but that's not possible for someone making $900 a month because they're seniors on disability. You know, like that's just not possible. We need the subsidized housing. We need the affordable housing, and something like Miller Park is not ideal. I think when we talk about, though, stabilizing people on the streets so that we can direct more money into housing, like there are some places where encampments are today that might be good candidates for bathrooms. And I know some of my colleagues mentioned the triage services. I think Councilmember Jennings, Councilmember Kaplan, and Talamantes put forward a proposal to say, what does it look like to triage camps where they are? We talked to the snake pit, right? I remember when Bridget Dean first came into DCR, she went back there and they said, oh yeah, we totally take that. You know, we would totally love to be staffed and to have bathrooms and trash cans and meals and stuff. So what does it look like to stabilize people? And that's the conversation next week, right? Like, how do we learn from what's working and not working at a place like Miller Park to continue to evolve that model? I don't want to spend money on 10,000 shelter beds. That's not the solution here. The solution is breaking the pipeline, because I want to reiterate what Nikki said in their comments when they mentioned navigation to nowhere, because that is sort of where we are, right? Like we have over 2,000 shelter beds. A lot of those folks are stable now. A lot of those folks have gotten services. A lot of those folks have their paperwork in order. They've gotten their benefits. They're ready, but they can't find any place they can go. I remember when we did the siting plan, someone called in from St. John's, a woman who'd been there for too long. And she was basically like, look, I want to free up the bed for the next woman and child behind me who needs this spot, but I can't leave yet because I've gotten this job and there's just like, no, there's nothing for me. I can't find anything. So I'm really glad we're talking about this, because yes, folks need services. They need temporary stabilization, but yes, eventually when they're ready, they need housing. And that has been the part of our homelessness conversation that we have been missing, is that connection between housing and where we are. So we've never really talked about what it's going to look like to produce. We've planned for it, right? We do the housing element and we do projects sort of in individual chunks when we get funding available, but we've never really talked about a strategy. How many permanent supportive housing units do we need? What would that cost? What is it going to take for us to move the levers of government to provide for the folks that the market will provide for? They never will. It's simple mathematics. But when they talk about the levers that drove people into homelessness, right? They talk a lot about exiting, right? Which I think this focuses on, well, having good job access, right? Having access to housing, that's part of it. But they also talked about what led people into homelessness. And in some cases, the most startling finding in the study was that it was $300 to $500 sometimes for somebody, right? $300 to $500. If they had just had that one-time infusion of cash, they could have moved, or they could have caught up on the rent, or they could have fixed the car, or they could have done the thing that eventually led the cascade effect that led them to being on the street, on a couch, in a car, on a street. So I don't want to lose in a housing strategy that emergency funding, and not just rent assistance, because we know a lot of homeowners struggle sometimes with emergency repairs, or they have an unexpected bill. So I think that emergency, how do we prevent people from losing their housing, is always going to be the cheapest harm reduction approach to homelessness. Because that's when when people on the street and the constituents are like, oh my gosh, these numbers have tripled, what the heck are you doing? That's one of the pieces we're missing, is we don't have, and we have 4,900 households that were waiting for emergency rent assistance that we weren't able to figure out funding for. 70% of those households are extremely low income. Those are folks that are on the path to going to the street simply because the government, we couldn't get just enough money to fill to fill that need. And we are now going to spend probably 10 times that much helping them get off the street once they get onto the street to get into housing. And so that's one strategy that I really want to make sure we don't lose, because I think it's a cost saving measure. And it's also just based on the research and the data we do have, which is, we're really lucky that report came out before we did this. And then the other part of this is purchasing of existing buildings, because we lose buildings when they go for sale. And I'll use an example of a senior housing complex on Capitol across from the Sophia. It was a huge, you'll know it, it's between Sutter and Sophia, that really tall, kind of weird 80s-ish looking concrete building. When they sold that, I mean, they didn't do anything wrong, right? I mean, it was out of its deed restriction. It didn't need to be senior housing anymore. Like, they were doing it right. But when they convert that into condos, that's now 100-something units we don't have for seniors anymore. And granted, it wasn't affordable senior housing, but that was an opportunity site, right? Like, when the Holiday Inn went for sale on 16th Street, that was an opportunity site. Like, how do we focus on, because that's always going to be cheaper per door if we're purchasing buildings and retrofitting them versus if we're constantly having to build new. Preventing displacement is going to be the strongest anti-homelessness strategy we can do. If we can keep people housed where they are, we can start focusing on the folks that are out there. And we can move, as the mayor often says, we do get people off the street successfully. This is not a matter of not knowing what to do. It's a matter of it's gone too big. We just simply, the system can't manage the number of people. So if we can slow down the inflow and then start focusing on the folks that are on the street, maybe we actually have a chance of making the type of tangible progress I know we'd all like to see in the next year or two. So.